Are you in the market for a Sony APS-C camera but you really do not know which one to choose? Well, you are in the right place, my friend, because in this video I'm going to be breaking down Sony's range of crop sensor cameras so that you can figure out which camera is right for you. As of the time of recording this video, Sony have 7 APS-C cameras in their range. APS-C cameras are sometimes commonly referred to as crop sensor cameras. Now, at first glance, you'd think that it's pretty obvious how Sony's hierarchy of cameras work, right? The higher the number, the better the camera. Well, not exactly. Annoyingly, Sony's numbering system is a little bit broken, and in order to work out the hierarchy, we need to first break down the cameras by release date. So starting off in 2014, we see the release of the A5100 and the A6000, which fall into these categories. In 2016, Sony expanded their crop sensor range to include the A6300 and the A6500, which added 2 more premium options to the list. The final 3 additions to the lineup were added in 2019 and were effectively updated versions of some of the existing cameras. So now in 2021, the lineup looks something like this. The A6100 is essentially an updated version of the A6000, the A6400 is an update of the A6300, and rather unsurprisingly, the A6600 was an upgrade for the A6500. Looking at the lineup in this way makes it a little easier to see how the cameras are tiered. However, you may still think that the A6500 is better than the A6400, for example. Well, unfortunately, that's not strictly true because, as we've just discussed, the A6400 was released in 2019, so it's pretty new, whereas the A6500 was released 5 years ago in 2016. This means that the A6400 is newer than the A6500, and as a result it includes a number of updated features that just aren't included on the A6500, despite it technically being a higher end camera. Some of these new features include things like an upgraded flip-up touchscreen that can be used for vlogging or for taking selfies, rather than the tilting screen design with no touch sensitivity seen on the older cameras. The newer cameras also feature improved IAF, which includes continuous tracking and animal IAF, whilst the older models only include a version of IAF that isn't able to continuously track a target. One of the other key additions is that the newer models will include Sony's latest color science, which, without getting into all that techie stuff, basically means that they produce better colors for your images. Despite these differences, there are a number of key similarities between all of the cameras within the range. Firstly, they're all able to capture 24 megapixel images in both RAW and JPEG. Now, these days, 24 megapixels is plenty big enough for most forms of photography, so you are pretty much covered no matter which camera you pick in the range. Lenses attached to the camera using Sony's E-mount, which is also found throughout all of Sony's mirrorless cameras, including their full-frame cameras too. This means you'll be able to use both APS-C and full-frame lenses on any of these crop sensor cameras, so long as they use Sony's E-mount system. Most of the cameras in the lineup also use the same NP-FW50 batteries, with the exception of the A6600, which uses the larger Z-type batteries that are more commonly used on Sony's full-frame cameras, but we'll talk a bit more about that later. It's also worth noting that although the other 2019 releases, namely the A6100 and A6400, use the smaller batteries, the cameras have been optimized so that they have better battery efficiency compared to the older 2016 and 2014 releases. So now we have a better understanding of the range, let's take a look at each of the categories in turn to see what they offer and how they differ from one another. Starting at the bottom of the totem, we have the A5100. This is currently the cheapest option available and is a very basic camera with limited functionality. This camera is really aimed at people who are looking to get started in photography and want to have the flexibility of an interchangeable lens camera, but aren't that bothered about having any of the high-end tech and maybe are a little bit afraid of having a camera with too many knobs and dials. In terms of hardware, this thing has a built-in pop-up flash, but there's no hot shoe mount for attaching a flash gun or a mic for video. It does have a nice flip-up touchscreen on the back, which is handy if you want to film yourself or take selfies. However, it doesn't have a viewfinder, so framing up and reviewing your photos is limited to just the rear screen. This camera is also the only one in the lineup not to feature a physical mode dial on the top, so shooting modes have to be adjusted using the rear screen as well. But if you're totally new to photography and buying cameras, maybe this is your first camera, then this may not be a problem for you, as you're most likely just going to have the camera on full auto mode to start with, at least until you find your feet. At full pelt, the A5100 can capture images in burst mode at up to 6 frames a second, and it features both human IAF and face detection, but no animal IAF. For video, it can capture 1080 HD footage at a maximum of 60 frames per second, though picture profiles and 4K are not available on this camera. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about when I mention picture profiles, then really don't worry too much. Basically, some cameras will allow you to apply a really flat picture profile to your video footage, which basically allows greater flexibility when you're editing your footage in post-production. If you're new to videography, then this probably won't matter to you for now. This camera also doesn't have any built-in stabilisation, so if you're not sure what this means, basically some higher-end cameras are able to counteract your hand movements when you're capturing stills or video to try and reduce camera shake for not only sharper photos, but also smoother looking video. If your camera doesn't have image stabilization built in and you want to capture shake-free footage, then you're probably going to need to invest in a tripod or a gimbal or something like that just to help you keep your camera steady whilst filming or taking photos. Or instead, you could just purchase a lens that has OSS or optical steady shot. This basically means that the lens will take care of the stabilization rather than your camera. Finally, this camera also lacks a headphone port for monitoring your audio and a microphone input, so it's really not a camera that's suited for any serious kind of video work. Next up, we have the A6000 and the A6100, both of which fall into what I would consider the entry-level tier of cameras. Both cameras offer more functionality than the A5100 that we just looked at, but they're still pretty reasonably priced. So what do these cameras have in common? Well, first off, they can both capture images at up to 11 frames per second in burst mode. They both have a viewfinder, a built-in flash, and a hot shoe mount for attaching things like a flash gun or maybe an external microphone for improved audio quality whilst filming. They both have a physical mode dial on top for quickly switching between the different shooting modes, and both of them have a microphone input on the side for attaching an external mic, though there's no headphone port for monitoring audio. Finally, neither camera has built-in image stabilization or any picture profiles for video work. Now we know what they have in common, what are the differences? Well, the most obvious difference is that the older A6000 has a standard tilting screen, whilst the newer A6100 features a much better flip-out touchscreen. The A6100 offers face detection as well as human IAF and animal IAF, whilst the older A6000 only has human IAF and face detection. In video mode, the A6000 can only shoot 1080 HD footage at up to 60 frames a second, whilst the A6100 has the option to record 4K at 30 frames a second, as well as 1080 HD at up to 60 frames a second. Although recording on the A6000 is limited to around 29 minutes, the A6100 benefits from unlimited recording, so you can just keep rolling footage until either your memory card fills up or your battery dies, whichever comes first. So with the next two cameras, we're kind of entering the mid-tier of camera with the A6300 and the A6400. Both of these cameras look pretty similar to the previous A6000 and A6100 models, though inside they do offer a slight upgrade in terms of functionality. Starting again with the similarities, and both cameras have viewfinders on top, a built-in flash, a hot shoe port, a physical mode dial, and they can capture images up to 11 frames per second in continuous burst mode. They both offer a mic input on the side, but again, no headphone slot for monitoring audio and no built-in image stabilization. Though the slightly good news for videographers is that both cameras offer picture profiles to allow you to gain super flat video footage for more flexibility in post. When it comes to the differences between these two cameras, the big one again would have to be the rear screen. The newer A6400 has a flip-up touchscreen, whilst the older A6300 is equipped with a standard tiltable monitor. The A6400 offers face detection, human IAF and animal IAF, whilst the older A6300 only has human IAF and face detection. When it comes to video, these two cameras are fairly evenly matched. They both offer 4K at 30 frames per second. However, the big difference is that in 1080 HD mode, the A6300 is capped at 60 frames per second, whilst the 6400 can reach up to 120 frames per second for super slow-mo footage. The A6300 is also limited to just 29 minutes of recording time, whilst the A6400 can record indefinitely. The final two cameras in the list are the high-end options, the A6500 and the A6600. These cameras offer the most in terms of functionality and are really aimed at professional photographers and videographers, or those who want a camera with all of the bells and whistles. Starting again with the similarities, and both cameras include a viewfinder, a hot shoe port, and a mode dial on the top of the camera. In burst mode, they can capture photos up to 11 frames per second, and both cameras can capture 4K footage at 30 frames per second or 1080 HD footage at up to 120 frames per second. Both cameras also benefit from a mic input on the side, and these two cameras are the only two in the lineup currently to include built-in image stabilization for shake-free footage. They also include cinematic profiles, all of which are big bonuses for videographers. In terms of the differences between these two cameras, although both cameras have a touchscreen monitor, the newer A6600 has a flip-up design, whereas the A6500 screen can only pull out and tilt. Interestingly, the newer A6600 doesn't have a built-in flash, whereas the A6500 does have one included. Now, the reason for this is that most professional photographers will almost always prefer to use an external flash gun anyway, or fire flashes off camera, as it gives much more creative control. So I assume Sony have decided to do away with the onboard flash on the A6600 because it's kind of not needed. The A6600 offers face detection, human IAF and animal IAF, whilst the older 6500 only has human IAF and face detection. The A6500 is limited to just 29 minutes of video recording, just like the other 2016 releases. However, the A6600 can record without limit. The A6600 is also the only Sony crop sensor camera to include a headphone port. So that means if you are a videographer that absolutely has to monitor the audio being captured by your camera, this is pretty much the only option for you. The final big difference between these two cameras, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is that the A6600 uses the newer Z-type battery. This means that it has a much better battery life than any of the other crop sensor cameras. Also, because it uses these larger batteries, this camera also has a slightly deeper grip than the other cameras, which means that it's slightly nicer to hold, especially if you have big hands. Now, before I wrap things up and talk about who I think each of these cameras are best suited towards, there's one final thing I should mention. Now, currently I own the A6500, I had it a number of years. I use it professionally for both photography and videography work as kind of a B camera, as a backup to my full frame A7 Mark IIIs, and it really is a great piece of kit. However, over the years of using it, I have found that it's got one big shortfall, and that's when shooting in 4K. This thing does have a tendency to overheat and just completely cut out. Now, this is no big secret that I'm revealing here. It's widely reported online, and it's supposedly an issue for both the A6500 and the A6300 when shooting in 4K. The newer 2019 cameras, so the A6100, 6400 and 6600, have all apparently been improved so they do not have this issue, or at the very least it's not anywhere near as bad as that on the 2016 cameras. But the bottom line is, if you're a videographer who is looking to film lots and lots of 4K footage, then just be aware that the 2016 cameras could cause you some issues. So now that we've gone through all of the cameras, which one should you buy? Well, ultimately, that depends on what you're going to use it for. If you're completely new to digital photography and perhaps you're on a super tight budget and video really isn't something that you're ever going to use, then it might be worth considering the older 5100 and 6000 models. I mean, sure, they're both showing their age a little bit, aren't we all? And they don't have the flashy features that the newer cameras do, but they're still very solid options, and you can also pick them up for a very reasonable price these days. Alternatively, if you're an amateur photographer or videographer, or maybe both, then realistically you're probably going to want to pick something up from the middle of the group, so either the A6100, 6300 or 6400. The one you pick will ultimately depend on which features you consider to be must-haves and which ones you can live without, whilst also sticking within your budget. Finally, if you're more of a pro photographer or an established photographer or videographer, then really you're going to be wanting to look at the A6500 or A6600. The A6600 is clearly the best choice in terms of features, but that does come at a cost. So if you can't stretch to that, but you want things like built-in image stabilization, then the A6500 might be worth a look. With all of that said, for me personally, my star pick of the entire bunch would have to be the A6400. It just offers a great choice of features at a price point that is still very much achievable. Now, before I go, I know I've gone through a lot of specs in this video, so if your brain feels like it's about to melt and fall out your ears, then don't worry, I've got your back. In the description below, there is a link to a Sony APS-C camera cheat sheet that I have lovingly created for you guys, which clearly lists the main features and specs that we've gone through in this video for all of the cameras so that you can easily cross-check for yourself and figure out which option is right for you. It's completely free to download, and if it helps you out, then just be sure to repay the favor by maybe liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you want more content like this, and maybe hell, even leaving me a comment below letting me know which camera you've decided to buy and why. Anyway, that's about it for now, guys. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all again next week with a brand new video.